My mother-in-law, a queen of Washington, D.C. society, constantly humiliated me for my provincial background. At a family dinner, she hit a new low, publicly shaming me over supposedly smudged glass to frame me as a slob in front of her family. In that moment, I knew my quiet attempts to earn her respect had failed. I decided to accept her challenge and move the battle to her territory, her own immaculate Capitol Hill townhouse. Like this video, and right where you are watching us from, we will be happy to send you our regards. Stay with us. Don't miss what's coming next. My name is Simone, and for the past year, I have been living a life that was not my own. It was a beautiful life, a life of quiet luxury and impeccable taste, but it was a borrowed life, a costume I wore in the hopes that one day it might feel like my own skin. The stage for this performance was Washington, D.C., a city that, like my mother-in-law, does not suffer fools gladly. It is a city of quiet power, of unspoken rules, where your zip code is your resume and your social circle is your currency. I was a transplant, a small-town girl from the quiet, marshy shores of Maryland's Eastern Shore, a place of hard-working fishermen and profound, unpretentious beauty. And I was now the wife of Sterling, a brilliant and kind lawyer, and the daughter-in-law of Vivian, the undisputed and formidable queen of our new shared world. Our home, a beautiful modern townhouse in a prosperous D.C. suburb, was a testament to Sterling's success and my own desperate attempt to fit in. I had decorated it with a careful, almost academic precision, following the unspoken rules of D.C. society. The walls were painted in shades of tasteful, non-committal gray. The furniture was elegant, minimalist, and deeply uncomfortable. The art was abstract and chosen more for its investment potential than for any love it inspired in my heart. My own vibrant, chaotic, and slightly messy personality had been carefully packed away, like a collection of old, beloved sweaters that were no longer suitable for my new climate. I was living in a polished cage, and the zookeeper, the woman who held the keys to my acceptance, was my husband's mother. Vivian was a woman carved from the very granite of Capitol Hill society. She was a pillar of the community, a formidable presence on a dozen charity boards, a woman whose entire life was a masterpiece of controlled, curated perfection. Her own townhouse on Capitol Hill was a museum of good taste, a place where a single, carelessly placed coaster would feel like an act of high treason. She was not an overtly cruel woman. Her weapon was not a club, but a scalpel. Her attacks were a series of 1,000 tiny paper cuts, small, almost invisible wounds that, over time, could make you feel as though you were bleeding to death. She would visit our home, her eyes the sharp, intelligent eyes of a hawk, scanning every surface for flaws. "Oh, Simone, darling," she would say, her voice a silken southern drawl that was both a comfort and a weapon. "This new cleaning service you've hired, I'm not sure they have the proper attention to detail." She would run a perfectly manicured finger along a bookshelf, a surface I had dusted just that morning, and inspect it for a single microscopic speck of dust. She would critique the flowers I arranged, the food I cooked, the way I dressed. Each comment was a small, subtle reminder of my own inadequacy, a quiet, persistent whisper that said, "You do not belong here. You are not good enough." And I, for the sake of my love for my husband, had endured it all with a quiet, smiling grace. Sterling, my kind, wonderful, and tragically conflict-averse husband, seemed to exist in a state of willful blindness to his mother's quiet campaign of psychological warfare. He saw only a loving mother and a slightly sensitive wife. He did not, or would not, see the slow, systematic erosion of my spirit that was happening under his own roof. My silence, my refusal to complain, had become my greatest enemy. I had taught Vivian that her behavior was acceptable, that I was a target who would not fight back. It was a lesson she had learned all too well. And tonight, at a small, intimate family dinner, that lesson was about to come to its painful and ultimately transformative conclusion. My love for Sterling was the sun around which my entire universe now revolved, and for the warmth of that love, I was willing to endure the long, cold shadow cast by his mother. Our own love story had been a beautiful, unlikely thing, a meeting of two different worlds. I met him during my last year of law school in DIC, a scholarship kid who had fought her way from the quiet, working-class shores of coastal Maryland to the hallowed halls of Georgetown. He was already a young associate at his father's prestigious law firm, a man born and bred in the rarefied air of Washington's black elite. He was everything I was not: polished, confident, and utterly at ease in a world that I was still struggling to navigate. He told me later that he had been drawn to what he called my authenticity. He was tired of the performative, transactional relationships of his social circle. He said I was like a breath of fresh, salt-tinged air, a woman who knew how to bait a hook and sail a boat, who spoke of her fisherman grandfather with a fierce, uncomplicated pride. In turn, I was drawn to his brilliant mind, his gentle kindness, and the sophisticated, ordered world he represented. Our love felt real, a solid, well-built structure in the middle of our two very different landscapes. The one fatal flaw in that structure, I would soon learn, was that its foundation rested on ground that was owned and controlled by his mother. I remember the first time I met Vivian, as if it were yesterday. Sterling had taken me to his family's ancestral home on Capitol Hill for Sunday brunch, a weekly ritual I would come to dread. The house was magnificent, a 3-story Victorian masterpiece filled with dark, imposing antique furniture, inherited silver, and the heavy, silent weight of generations of social and political power. Vivian had greeted me at the door, a tall, impeccably dressed woman with a smile that was a work of art, a perfect, beautiful, and utterly impenetrable facade. The afternoon was a masterclass in her particular brand of psychological warfare. There were no overt insults, no crude displays of disapproval. There were only the 1,000 tiny, perfectly aimed paper cuts. The Eastern Shore, she had mused as she handed me a cup of tea in a porcelain cup so delicate I was terrified I would break it. How wonderfully rustic. Sterling tells me your grandfather was a waterman. It must be such a simple, honest way of life. The words were polite, but the subtext was clear. You are simple. You are common. You are not one of us. She asked me about my law school, and when I told her I was on a full academic scholarship, she had said, "How marvelous. It is so important for families like ours to support the less fortunate." She had, in a single perfectly crafted sentence, reframed my greatest achievement as an act of her own class's charity. I had spent the entire afternoon feeling like an insect under a microscope, every word, every gesture, every small mistake in etiquette being observed, catalogued, and judged. And Sterling, my brilliant, perceptive Sterling, had seen none of it. He saw only his mother's natural curiosity, her genuine interest in my life. He was a man who had lived his entire life within the warm, protective walls of his mother's approval, and he could not, or would not, recognize those same walls as the bars of a cage for anyone else. And so, I began my long, silent, and deeply lonely campaign to win her over. I believed with the earnest, hard-working ethos of my upbringing that her approval was something that could be earned. I believed that if I was just perfect enough, if my home was immaculate enough, my dinner parties elegant enough, my conversation witty enough, she would eventually, inevitably, see my worth. I studied her world like a foreign country, learning its customs, its language, its intricate and unspoken rules. I spent my days in a state of constant low-grade anxiety, polishing my home, my manners, and myself, trying to buff away the rough, provincial edges of my own identity until I was as smooth, as perfect, and as lifeless as the polished silver in Vivian's dining room. This relentless pursuit of her approval was the backdrop for the dinner party that would become my breaking point. It was not a grand formal affair. It was something far more terrifying. A small, intimate gathering at our home. The guests were to be Vivian, her sister, and 2 of her oldest, and most notoriously sharp-tongued friends. I knew this was not a social call. It was an inspection. It was a test. And it was one I was determined to pass. I spent a week preparing. I deep-cleaned every inch of the house. I planned a menu that was both sophisticated and yet seemingly effortless. My anxiety was a tight, hot knot in my stomach, a constant companion in the days leading up to the event. The night of the dinner, as I stood in my pristine, silent kitchen, waiting for the sound of the doorbell, I felt like a student about to take a final, brutal exam. An exam on which the entire future of my life depended. The chime of the doorbell at precisely 7 o'clock was a sound that signaled both a beginning and an end. It was the beginning of my final examination. And the end, though, I did not know it yet, of the woman I had been trying so hard to be. I opened the door to a formidable, united front of Washington, D.C. high society. There was Vivian, my mother-in-law, a vision in a Chanel suit the color of cream, her smile a perfect, polished weapon. Beside her stood her sister, my Aunt Caroline, a woman with an even sharper tongue and an expression of perpetual mild disapproval. And flanking them were Vivian's two oldest and most loyal friends, women whose families had been fixtures in the capital for generations, women who could build or destroy a reputation with a single, well-placed whisper at a cocktail party. They were not guests. They were a firing squad, and I was the one they had come to execute. They swept into my home, their initial compliments a series of perfectly aimed backhanded blows. "Simone, darling, the house looks so clean," Vivian began, her eyes scanning the living room, the subtle emphasis on the word clean implying that this was a rare and surprising state of affairs. "What a cozy space you've created," Aunt Caroline added, her gaze taking in the modest, by their standards, size of our living room. I smiled, and I poured champagne, my hand steady, my own performance of the perfect, gracious hostess in full swing. My husband, Sterling, hovered nervously, a man desperately trying to broker a peace between two worlds that were fundamentally at war. The dinner itself was a masterclass in psychological torture. I served the meal I had spent a week perfecting, a complex multi-course affair that was meant to showcase my sophistication, my attention to detail. They picked at it, their praise so faint and so condescending it was more insulting than any criticism. "This sea bass is quite adequate, dear," one of the friends, a woman named Eleanor, commented, as if surprised that I was capable of producing something edible. The conversation at the table was a weapon, a carefully curated discussion of a world to which I would never belong. They spoke of political fundraisers I had not been invited to, of upcoming charity galas for which I was not on the committee, of summer trips to Martha's Vineyard and winter trips to Gstaad. It was a deliberate and brutally effective display of their social and financial superiority, a conversation designed to make me feel like a small provincial child listening in on the talk of the grown-ups. Through it all, I maintained my composure. I smiled, I nodded, I played the part of the deferential, slightly overwhelmed but deeply grateful daughter-in-law. I was passing the test, I thought. I was enduring. I was surviving. But the final and most devastating attack was yet to come. It came as it so often did with Vivian, not with a loud, explosive bang, but with a quiet, devastatingly precise incision. We had just finished the main course, and I was clearing the plates. As I reached for Vivian's water glass, she held up a hand, a small, elegant gesture that stopped me in my tracks. "One moment, dear," she said, her voice full of a sweet, false concern. She picked up her own crystal water glass, a glass I had washed and polished by hand just that afternoon, and she held it up to the candlelight. She squinted at it, her head tilted, as if examining a flawed diamond. The entire table fell silent, watching her. "Oh dear," she sighed, a sound of such profound theatrical disappointment it was a performance in itself. She turned to her sister and her friends, a look of pained apology on her face. "You must forgive Simone," she said, her voice a loud, carrying whisper that was meant for the entire room to hear. "She tries so very hard. But she comes from a place where, well, the standards are just different." She then turned her gaze to me, my hand still frozen in midair, a look of deep, pitying condescension in her eyes. "A clean glass, my dear," she said, her voice now a lesson from a teacher to a particularly slow student, "is the most basic, fundamental sign of a well-kept and respectable home. It speaks to one's standards, you see." The public nature of the rebuke, the casual crushing cruelty of it, was a physical blow. A hot, prickling wave of shame washed over me, so intense it made me feel dizzy. I could feel the eyes of her friends on me, their expressions a mixture of pity and a cold, satisfying vindication. I looked at my husband, at Sterling, praying he would say something, that he would defend me, that he would finally stand up to his mother. He did not. He simply stared down at his plate, his silence a final and most profound betrayal. And in that moment, something inside me, the part of me that had been so desperate for her approval, the part that had been willing to shrink myself, to erase myself, to fit into her perfect, polished world, finally, blessedly, died. The grief for the mother-in-law I would never have and for the husband I had thought I had was a sharp, clean pain. And in its place, something new, something cold and hard and wonderfully, liberatingly, angry, began to grow. I looked at the four of them, these queens of their own small, meaningless kingdom, and I did not feel small. I felt a surge of a power I had never known I possessed. I gave Vivian my most brilliant, practiced, and gracious smile. "You are absolutely right, Vivian," I said, my voice a perfect, sweet imitation of her own. "Attention to detail is everything." And in my mind, a new and beautifully detailed plan began to form. The front door closed, the sound of my mother-in-law's triumphant, tinkling laughter fading into the quiet of the night, and I was left alone in the wreckage. Sterling, my husband, immediately began the familiar, useless work of damage control, the verbal equivalent of sweeping broken glass under a rug. "That's just how Mom is, Simone," he said, his voice a low, placating murmur as he began to clear the dinner plates. "You can't take it so personally. She doesn't mean anything by it. It's her way of showing she cares." I looked at him, at this good, kind man whose one fatal flaw was a spine made of jelly where his mother was concerned, and I felt a profound and final sense of resignation. He did not see. He would never see. He could not comprehend that his mother's words were not just the harmless critiques of a concerned matriarch. They were a systematic, deliberate, and deeply cruel campaign to erase me. To him, this was just another awkward family dinner. To me, it was a battle in a war for my own soul, a battle he had just allowed me to lose. In that moment, I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the marble countertops in my kitchen, that I was completely and utterly on my own. I did not weep that night. I did not storm off to the bedroom to cry into my pillow. The part of me that was capable of being wounded by Vivian's opinion, the part that so desperately craved her approval, had died at that dinner table somewhere between the sea bass and the condescending lecture on glassware. The hurt, the shame, it had all been burned away, leaving behind the cold, clean, and wonderfully liberating engine of a pure, calculated rage. I went to bed, and I lay there in the darkness, my eyes wide open, and I did not grieve. I planned. The engineer in my father, the fisherman in my grandfather, the quiet, pragmatic, and deeply resilient woman I had been before, I had tried to polish myself into a shape that would please them. That woman had finally fully reawakened. I saw my situation with a new, startling clarity. I had been fighting a defensive war on a battlefield of my mother-in-law's choosing, my own home, and on that battlefield I would always lose because she was the one who wrote the rules. To win, I realized, I had to change the terrain. I had to move the battle to her home. I had to fight her not with my own weapons of quiet endurance and a desperate hope for kindness, but with hers, the subtle, vicious, and publicly humiliating weapon of social etiquette. She had used a smudged water glass to declare me unfit. I would use her own impeccable standards to detonate her entire perfect world. The idea, when it came to me in the pre-dawn darkness, was so audacious, so terrifying, and so utterly perfect that I almost laughed out loud. It was a declaration of war, and I knew, with a thrilling, unfamiliar surge of power, that it was a war I was going to win. The days following the dinner party were a masterclass in the art of the long war. I did not rage. I did not issue ultimatums to Sterling. I did something far more effective. I retreated. I became a ghost in my own home, a creature of quiet, polite, and impenetrable surfaces. My pain, which had been a raw, open wound, was now a private, sacred thing, a source of a new, cold, and unfamiliar power. I built a wall of perfect, smiling civility between myself and my husband, a wall he could not see, but one he could most certainly feel. He would come home from work, and I would have a beautiful dinner waiting. I would ask about his day with a detached, journalistic curiosity. I would perform the role of the perfect wife, but the soul of that wife, the warm, trusting, and deeply loving woman he had taken for granted, was gone. And her absence, I could see, was beginning to unnerve him more than any shouted accusation ever could. "Are you okay, Simone?" he asked me one evening, as we sat in the sterile, perfect silence of our living room. "You've been so quiet lately." "I'm fine, Sterling," I had replied, not looking up from my book, "just thinking." "About what?" he pressed, a note of a new anxious uncertainty in his voice. I finally looked up at him, and I gave him a small cryptic smile. "About standards," I said, "and attention to detail." While my outward demeanor was one of serene, almost zen-like calm, my mind was a churning, brilliant engine of strategic planning. I knew I had one shot to execute my plan perfectly. It could not be a clumsy, emotional outburst. It had to be a work of performance art, a piece of theater so perfectly calibrated and so devastatingly effective that it would permanently redraw the map of our family's power dynamics. I needed a stage, a pretext, a legitimate reason to be in my mother-in-law's home, in her inner sanctum during one of her carefully curated social gatherings. And Vivian, in her arrogance, gave me one herself. An invitation arrived a week later, a thick, cream-colored card with elegant, embossed lettering. It was for a small post-gala reception at Vivian's Capitol Hill townhouse, an exclusive gathering for the major donors of a charity ball she had co-chaired. My name was on the invitation, a perfunctory and no doubt reluctant addition to my husband's. To decline would be to signal my defeat, to admit that she had broken me. To accept was to walk willingly into the lion's den. I placed the invitation on the hall table for Sterling to see. "Your mother has invited us to a reception at her home next Saturday," I said, my voice a model of casual neutrality. He looked at me, a hopeful, pleading look in his eyes. He saw this as a chance for a truce, a return to normalcy. He had no idea I was seeing it as the perfect opportunity for my declaration of war. The week leading up to the party was spent in a state of quiet, focused preparation. I was not just preparing an outfit, I was preparing a character. I was an actress, studying for the most important role of my life. I went to the library and I researched. I read books on etiquette, on the history of Washington, D.C., society, on the subtle, unspoken codes of the old money elite. I was not trying to learn how to fit in. I was learning how to expertly and devastatingly tear the whole facade down from the inside. I also made a phone call to my grandfather. He was a man of few words, a man who had spent his entire life on the water, his character as rugged and as resilient as the Chesapeake Bay itself. I told him I loved him, and then I asked him a few very specific questions about the proper way to clean a fishing boat. The night of the reception, I stood before the mirror in our bedroom and I looked at my reflection. The woman who looked back was a stranger, a work of artifice. I wore a simple, elegant black dress, a dress that was both expensive and so understated it was almost invisible. My hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. My makeup was flawless, a mask of perfect, serene beauty. I was the perfect, polished wife, the perfect, respectable daughter-in-law. I was everything Vivian had ever wanted me to be, and tonight, I was going to use that perfection to destroy her. Sterling looked at me, a look of profound relief and admiration on his face. "You look beautiful, Simone," he said, taking my hand. "Absolutely beautiful. Tonight will be a good night." I can feel it. I just smiled at him, a secret burning behind my eyes. The drive to Capitol Hill was silent. I was a general running through the final battle plans in my mind. Sterling, bless his heart, was a happy, oblivious foot soldier, humming along to the jazz on the radio, convinced he was on his way to a peace treaty. He had no idea he was my Trojan horse, the gift I was using to gain access to the enemy's fortress. As we pulled up to the magnificent floodlit facade of Vivian's townhouse, my heart was not pounding with anxiety. It was a slow, steady, and perfectly calm drumbeat. The war was about to begin. Vivian's Capitol Hill townhouse was not a home. It was a statement, a perfectly preserved 3-story Victorian masterpiece. It stood on a quiet, gaslit street, a silent, imposing testament to the longevity of her family's power and influence. The air inside was still and cool, smelling faintly of lemon oil, old money, and a profound, unshakable self-regard. As Sterling and I stepped into the grand black and white tiled foyer, we walked directly into the heart of Vivian's inner sanctum. She was holding court in her formal drawing room, surrounded by her sister and the same 2 sharp-eyed, tastefully jeweled women from the disastrous dinner party. They were a flock of elegant, predatory birds perched on priceless antique chairs, their conversation a low, confident murmur of social maneuvering and quiet, deadly gossip. The moment we entered, the conversation stopped. 4 pairs of eyes, as sharp and as discerning as a hawk's, turned to fix on me. The air was thick with a triumphant, expectant silence. They were waiting for the final act of my surrender, and I was determined to give them a performance they would never forget. I took a deep, calming breath, and I walked towards my mother-in-law, a perfect, apologetic, and deeply remorseful expression on my face. "Vivian," I began, my voice a soft, humble murmur, the voice of a defeated woman, "I am so sorry for my behavior the other evening. You were right to be upset. I was emotional, and I was a terrible hostess. A slow, magnanimous smile spread across Vivian's face. It was the smile of a queen accepting the fealty of a conquered and unruly vassal. She had won. She had broken me. "Oh, think nothing of it, dear," she said, her voice a silken, patronizing purr. "We all have our emotional moments. I'm just glad you've come to your senses." She gestured to a nearby tray of champagne flutes. "Now come, have a glass of champagne. Let's put this whole unpleasant little episode behind us." It was a gesture of dominance, an invitation back into her good graces, but on her terms as her subordinate. It was also the fatal mistake I had been waiting for. "Thank you, Vivian," I said, my voice full of a gratitude that was as false as it was convincing. I took one of the delicate crystal flutes, my hand perfectly steady. And then my performance began. Instead of drinking, I began to wander through the room, my expression one of wide-eyed provincial awe. "Oh, Vivian, your home is just breathtaking," I gushed, my voice a perfect imitation of a starstruck country mouse. I ran my finger along the surface of a magnificent 18th century mahogany sideboard, a piece I knew was her pride and joy. I paused, and my expression shifted to one of exaggerated theatrical concern. I squinted at my fingertip. "Oh my," I said, my voice a loud carrying whisper. "Vivian, darling, I do believe your cleaning service may have missed a spot. You know," I said, looking at her with a perfect imitation of her own concerned, pitying expression, "how important attention to detail is." A stunned electric silence fell over the room. Her friends stared at me, their mouths slightly agape. Vivian's smile froze on her face, the warmth in her eyes instantly replaced by a flicker of cold reptilian fury. Sterling, who had been breathing a sigh of relief, now looked as if he had been struck by lightning, but I was not finished. I had only just begun. I turned my attention to the champagne flute in my hand, the weapon she herself had so foolishly armed me with. I held the glass up to the light of the crystal chandelier, just as she had done in my home. I turned it slowly, inspecting it from every angle, my brow furrowed in a look of deep, serious concentration. The silence in the room was now so profound it was a physical presence. The four women watched me, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips, their expressions a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible understanding. I finally found the microscopic, non-existent smudge I was looking for. I let out a long, slow, and deeply disappointed sigh. I did not look at Vivian. I turned to her oldest and most influential friend, the formidable Eleanor. "Madam," I said, and my voice was no longer the soft, humble whisper of the defeated daughter-in-law. It was a new voice, a voice that was as clear, as strong, and as resonant as a striking bell. "The deck of my grandfather's fishing boat," I said, my words slow, deliberate, and perfectly enunciated, "was cleaner than this glass. And he used to wash it with salt water and a deck brush." The sentence, with its shocking, brutal, and deeply provincial imagery, landed in the center of that pristine, perfect, and silent drawing room like a cannonball. It was an act of social terrorism. I had taken her own weapon, her own obsession with standards and cleanliness, and I had turned it back on her with a force she could have never anticipated. I had not just criticized her home. I had, in a single devastating sentence, held up my own humble, hard-working, and authentic world as the standard against which her own shallow, polished, and now deeply tarnished world was to be judged. And I had found hers wanting. I stood there, holding the crystal flute, my expression calm and unreadable, and I watched as the perfect, controlled, and magnificent world of Vivian Dubois finally, completely, and irrevocably began to shatter. The silence that followed my declaration was the most profound I have ever experienced. It was not an empty silence. It was a dense, heavy, and deeply shocked silence, a vacuum created by the sudden, violent detonation of a social bomb in the most impeccably decorated drawing room in Washington, D.C. The four women, Vivian, her sister, and her two friends, were frozen, their faces a comical, horrifying tableau of disbelief. They looked like figures in a wax museum, their polite socialite smiles having melted into masks of pure, unadulterated shock. The crystal champagne flute in my hand felt like a scepter, a symbol of a power I had just, for the first time, claimed as my own. My husband, Sterling, was the first to move. He made a small, strangled noise in the back of his throat, a sound of a man who has just witnessed a terrible, unthinkable accident and has no idea how to clean it up. But I was not finished. The performance was not yet complete. I had their full, undivided attention, and I was not about to waste it. With a slow, deliberate grace, I placed the offending champagne flute on a nearby tray. Then I continued my inspection. I walked over to the grand marble mantelpiece, a fixture that was as old and as imposing as the family itself. I ran my white glove, which I was still wearing, along the surface, and then inspected the fingertip with an exaggerated, critical frown, just as Vivian had done in my home. And the dust. I sighed, my voice a loud, clear, and deeply concerned whisper that carried across the silent room. It's just everywhere. One must be so careful. Dust can be so common. That was the final blow. The performance was too specific, too perfectly aimed, too undeniably a mirror of Vivian's own cruel social weaponry. It was an act of such audacious, targeted, and intelligent mockery that it broke the spell of their shock. Eleanor, the friend whose glass I had so brutally maligned, was the first to crack. She stood up, her movements jerky, her face flushed a deep, embarrassed red. "Vivian, darling," she stammered, not looking at me. "It is getting rather late. I really must be going." The other friend and Aunt Caroline quickly followed suit, a flurry of mumbled excuses and hasty goodbyes. They were fleeing the battlefield. They were abandoning their queen. They were terrified that my strange provincial madness might be contagious, or worse, that they might become my next target. In the space of 5 minutes, the room was empty. Vivian's army, her audience, her social armor, it was all gone. And she was left alone, in the middle of her perfect, silent drawing room, to face the quiet, smiling, and utterly transformed country mouse who had just burned her entire kingdom to the ground. With her friends, her audience, her social armor all gone, the serene mask-like composure of Vivian Dubois finally and completely shattered. The polite, condescending matriarch was gone, and in her place was a woman consumed by a pure, white-hot, and deeply personal fury. She turned to me. Her eyes, which had just moments before been wide with a shocked disbelief, now narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated venom. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was no longer the silken southern drawl of a society hostess. It was a low, vicious hiss, the sound of a snake whose territory had been invaded. "How dare you?" she began, the words tight, clipped, and shaking with a rage she could no longer contain. "How dare you come into my home, a home that has been in my family for 100 years, and behave like some kind of savage? You ungrateful, provincial little nobody. I knew from the moment Sterling brought you home that you were not one of us. You are common, you are cheap, and you have just proven it to the entire world." It was a torrent of pure, unfiltered classism and cruelty, the unvarnished, ugly truth of what she had thought of me from the very beginning. Every insecurity she had so expertly, so patiently cultivated in me over the last year, she now threw back in my face as a weapon. My husband, Sterling, finally found his voice. A weak, panicked bleat of a sound. "Mother, please," he began, taking a step towards her, his hands held up in a useless gesture of peace. "Simone, honey, let's all just calm down." We both turned on him at the same time. "You stay out of this, Sterling," Vivian snapped, her fury now directed at her son. "This is your fault. You were the one who brought this creature into our family. You should have controlled her." "Controlled me?" I echoed, and I let out a short, sharp, and utterly humorless laugh. I turned my own gaze to my husband, and my voice was as cold and as sharp as ice. "Is that what you were supposed to be doing all this time, Sterling? Was that your job? Because I have to tell you, you have failed spectacularly." He flinched as if I had slapped him, a man caught in a brutal crossfire he had allowed to be created through his own spineless inaction. He was a useless, irrelevant figure in this battle. The war was, and had always been, between the two of us. Vivian, having exhausted her initial wave of rage, was now breathing heavily, her perfectly composed facade in ruins. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of hatred and a new, dawning, and deeply unwelcome understanding. She was beginning to see that this was not a random hysterical outburst. This was a calculated, strategic, and deeply personal counterattack. I let the silence stretch, letting her rage burn itself out, leaving only the cold, hard ash of the truth. Then I spoke. My voice was no longer the sharp, mocking tone of my performance. It was quiet, it was calm, and it was full of a sad, weary clarity. "I just wanted you to feel it, Vivian," I said, my voice a simple, honest statement of fact, just for one moment. I wanted you to feel the humiliation, the profound, soul-crushing humiliation of being judged and found wanting in your own home, in front of your own friends. I wanted you to feel what it's like to have someone hold up a piece of your life, a piece of your effort, and declare it to be not good enough. I wanted you to know what it feels like to be told that your standards are common, that your very being is a disappointment. I took a step closer to her, my own eyes now holding hers, and I saw not a monster but a shocked, wounded, and profoundly insecure woman. That, I said, my voice softening but losing none of its power, is what you have done to me. Not just at the dinner party, but every time you have stepped into my house for the past year. Every condescending comment, every backhanded compliment, every pitying look. Every one of them was a small, quiet, and deliberate attempt to tell me that I did not belong, that I was not worthy. Tonight, I concluded, I simply decided to use your own language, to play by your own rules. It is a very ugly game, isn't it? My words, the quiet, simple truth of them, were a mirror. A mirror I held up to her, forcing her to see the reflection of her own cruelty. For the first time, she was not just seeing my pain, she was feeling it. The realization, the sudden, shocking empathy, was a blow from which her pride could not defend her. Her face, which had been a mask of rage, crumpled. Her perfectly painted lips trembled. And her eyes, the sharp, intelligent eyes of the hawk, filled with the hot, shameful tears of a woman who has just been forced to confront the true ugly nature of her own soul. The silence that followed the breaking of Vivian's spirit was a profound and desolate thing. Her tears were not loud, theatrical sobs, but the quiet, ragged, and utterly defeated weeping of a queen who has been deposed in her own throne room. She had been so thoroughly, so expertly, and so publicly dismantled, using her own weapons, that she had no defenses left. Her pride, her arrogance, her entire carefully constructed world of social superiority had been revealed to be nothing more than a fragile, hollow facade. And I, her quiet, provincial daughter-in-law, was the one who had taken the hammer to it. My husband, Sterling, stood frozen between us, a man rendered utterly obsolete by the raw, powerful, and deeply female war that had just been waged in front of him. He looked at his weeping mother, then at me, his calm, victorious wife, and his face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. He had spent his entire life navigating the delicate, treacherous currents of his mother's moods, and he had just witnessed a small, unassuming fishing boat sail directly into the heart of her hurricane and sink her entire fleet. The battle was over. The victory was mine. And the only thing I felt was a deep, profound, and soul-crushing weariness. I had not wanted this war, but I had been left with no other choice. I turned to my husband, and my voice was quiet, but it held a new, unbreakable note of command. "Sterling," I said, "we're leaving." He simply nodded, a puppet whose strings had just been handed to a new master. He moved to his mother's side, a clumsy, hesitant gesture of comfort, but she flinched away from his touch, her shame too great to be witnessed, even by her own son. He was left with his hand hovering in the empty air between them, a perfect physical metaphor for his own uselessness in this entire tragic affair. The car ride back to our home was a journey through a new, uncharted territory. For the first time, the silence between us was not my own anxious, placating silence. It was his. He drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the road. I sat in the passenger seat, looking out at the blur of the city lights, and I did not try to fill the quiet. I let him sit in the profound, uncomfortable, and deeply necessary silence of his own consequences. He had been a spectator to a war he should have fought on my behalf years ago, and he was now, finally, beginning to understand the cost of his own cowardice. When we arrived back at our house of glass, the space itself felt different. It was no longer a polished cage where I performed the role of the perfect wife. It was my territory, my domain. I had defended its honor, and in doing so, I had claimed it as my own. Sterling walked into the house behind me, a hesitant, uncertain guest in a home that had, just a few hours before, been the kingdom of his own casual neglect. He followed me into the living room, a lost, broken man, finally ready to talk, to apologize, to try and mend the chasm that now yawned between us. "Simone," he began, his voice a raw, pleading whisper, I had no idea. I am so sorry." I held up a hand, a quiet gesture that stopped him mid-sentence. I was not ready for his apology. An apology now would be too easy, a cheap and simple bandage on a wound that was a decade deep. "Not tonight, Sterling," I said, my voice weary but firm. I looked at him, at this man I had loved, this man who had been my partner, and I knew that the foundation of our marriage had been revealed to be nothing but sand. "Things are going to be different now," I said, and the statement was not a threat. It was a simple, unshakable, and geological fact. The dynamic of this family, of you and me and your mother, it is going to change. Your role as the silent, neutral peacemaker is over, because you were never neutral. Your silence was a choice, and it was a choice against me. From now on, you will have to make a different choice. I left him standing there, in the middle of our silent, beautiful, and broken living room, and I walked over to the wall where a large, abstract, and deeply tasteful piece of art hung, a painting that Vivian had helped us choose. I took it down from the wall, I carried it to the hall closet, and I placed it in the back, in the darkness. Then I went to my own private study, a room he rarely entered, and I took down a painting that had been a gift from my grandfather. It was a wild, vibrant, and deeply provincial landscape of the marshes of my home, a painting that pulsed with a raw, untamed, and authentic life. It was a piece of my own soul, a piece I had kept hidden. I carried it back to the living room, and I hung it on the empty wall, in the place of honor, in the center of my home. The act was a quiet, simple, and profound declaration. The war was over, and the new queen was home. The morning after my revolution was a morning of profound and unsettling silence. The storm had passed, both outside and in, leaving a world that was washed clean but also strangely empty. I woke up in our bed alone. Sterling had slept in the guest room, a silent and no doubt terrified act of concession. I walked into my living room, and the first thing I saw was my grandfather's painting, hanging in the place of honor on the main wall. It was a vibrant, chaotic, and deeply authentic splash of color in the middle of my otherwise pristine, tasteful, and dishonest life. It was a declaration of independence, and its presence seemed to change the very quality of the light in the room. When Sterling finally emerged, he moved through the house with the cautious, uncertain steps of a man navigating a foreign country without a map. He was a ghost in his own home. The easy, casual authority he had always possessed, the quiet, masculine confidence of a man who was the undisputed king of his own castle, was gone. He looked at me, not with the familiar condescending affection of a husband, but with a new, strange mixture of fear, confusion, and a dawning, grudging respect. He was for the first time truly seeing me, not as the simple provincial girl he had married, not as the compliant, peacekeeping wife he had taken for granted, but as a formidable, complex, and utterly unpredictable stranger. We ate breakfast in a silence that was a universe away from the tense, simmering silences of the past. Those had been his silences, weapons of his disapproval that I had frantically tried to fill with apologies and appeasements. This silence was mine. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated power. I was the one who was calm, who was in control. He was the one who was walking on eggshells. His every movement a question, his every glance a plea for a new set of rules he did not yet understand. He tried to speak, to apologize, to begin the work of mending the chasm that now lay between us. "Simone," he began, his voice a raw, uncertain thing, "about last night." I did not let him finish. I was not ready for his apology. I was not interested in his excuses. The time for talking, for his weak, ineffectual words was over. "The coffee is good this morning, isn't it?" I had said, my voice bright, cheerful, and utterly impenetrable. I decided to try a new blend. I had steered the conversation to the most mundane, the most impersonal of topics, a clear and deliberate signal that the old, intimate pathways between us were now closed for repair. The look of hurt, of confusion, of a deep and profound loss in his eyes was a small, sharp, and deeply satisfying victory. In my own heart, however, the victory was a hollow one. I had won the battle. I had shattered my mother-in-law's spirit and had completely inverted the power dynamic in my own marriage, but the cost of that victory was a profound and deeply unsettling loneliness. I had fought to make a space for myself in this family, and in doing so, I had perhaps broken the family itself. Was this what I wanted? A life of cold, victorious solitude. A marriage that was not a partnership, but a quiet, ongoing state of surrender. His this time instead of mine. I looked at my grandfather's painting, at its wild, untamed, and beautiful depiction of my home, a place of authenticity and truth. And I knew, with a certainty that was both liberating and terrifying, that I could not and would not continue to live a life that was a lie, even if the lie was now in my favor. The week following my quiet declaration of independence was a week of profound and unsettling stillness. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the cannons have fallen silent, a silence heavy with the ghosts of what has been lost and the terrifying, unknown shape of what is to come. Sterling continued to sleep in the guest room, a silent, physical acknowledgement of the chasm that now lay between us. Our conversations were a sparse, carefully navigated minefield of politeness. We spoke of the weather, of the news, of the mundane operational details of our shared life. We did not speak of what had happened. We did not speak of his mother. The wound was too raw, too deep, and we were two surgeons circling a patient unsure of where to make the first incision. In the midst of this new Cold War, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Sterling, and the return address was his mother's Capitol Hill townhouse. I placed it on the hall table, my hand steady, my heart a calm, quiet, and disinterested observer. A week ago, the sight of her elegant, looping handwriting would have sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Now, I felt nothing. It was a letter from a foreign country, a country I no longer had any interest in visiting. Sterling opened it that evening, his face a mask of weary resignation. I watched him from across the living room as he read. I saw his shoulders slump, saw him run a hand through his hair in a gesture of profound, helpless exhaustion. He looked up at me, his eyes full of a sad, pleading confusion. "She wants to see us," he said, his voice a low, defeated thing. "Both of us. For dinner. On Sunday." "No," I said, my voice simple, quiet, and absolute. "Simone, please," he begged. "She's my mother. She's not doing well. She hasn't left the house since that night. Caroline says she just sits in the dark. She won't talk to anyone." "That is not my concern," I said, my voice as cold and as hard as the marble floors in Vivian's foyer. "My days of sacrificing my own peace for the sake of your mother's emotional comfort are over. This isn't for her," he insisted, taking a step towards me. "It's for me. For us. How are we ever supposed to move forward if we can't even try to fix this?" I looked at him, at this man who was still trying to be a bridge between two worlds, not understanding that one of those worlds had been burned to the ground. "There is nothing to fix, Sterling," I said. "Your mother and I now have an understanding. A new boundary has been drawn. She will stay on her side of it, and I will stay on mine. That is the only fix that is possible." But I saw the genuine pain in his eyes, the deep tearing agony of a man caught between his mother and his wife, and a small unexpected flicker of the old familiar pity stirred within me. "You may go," I said, a queen granting a small strategic concession. "You may go and have dinner with your mother. But I will not." He went. And when he returned, late on Sunday night, he was a changed man. The last lingering vestiges of his hopeful, peacemaking optimism were gone, replaced by a grim, quiet, and deeply shaken understanding. I did not ask him what had happened. I did not need to. I saw it in his eyes. He had, for the first time, been forced to face the full, unvarnished, and unfiltered force of his mother's misery, without me there to act as his shield. As he later told me, the dinner had been a nightmare. Vivian was a ghost in her own home, her perfect, polished facade completely gone, leaving only the raw, weeping wound of her own shattered pride. She had not raged at him. She had done something far worse. She had wept. She had cried with the heartbroken, bewildered tears of a woman who had been publicly, brutally, and in her own mind, unjustly dethroned. She had painted me as a monster, a cruel, calculating viper she had welcomed into her family only to be bitten. And Sterling, for the first time, had been forced to defend me, to defend my actions, to try and explain the years of quiet, subtle cruelty that had led to that final, explosive confrontation. But I was only trying to help her, Vivian had wailed, her narrative of victimhood now fully formed. I was only trying to teach her our ways, to guide her. And Sterling, my husband, had finally at long last found his voice. "You weren't guiding her, Mom," he had said, his own voice breaking. "You were breaking her." And I stood by and I let it happen. This is not her fault. It is ours. The admission, the final, painful, and long overdue acceptance of his own complicity was the beginning of his own personal reckoning. He had come home from that dinner a different man, a man who had finally truly understood the nature of the war that had been waged in his own home. He had finally chosen a side, and it was mine. Sterling came home from his mother's house that Sunday night a different man. The easy, casual charm, the conflict-averse optimism, all of it, had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, humbled, and finally awakened soul of a man who had been forced to look into the abyss of his own complicity. He walked into our living room, where I was sitting in the quiet darkness, my grandfather's painting a silent, watchful presence on the wall, and he did not offer excuses or platitudes. He simply came and knelt on the floor in front of my chair, a gesture of such profound and uncharacteristic humility that it took my breath away. He took my hands in his and he looked at me, his eyes full of a pain and a clarity I had never seen before. "I saw it tonight," he began, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "I finally saw what you've been seeing all along. The cruelty, the manipulation, the way she uses her love like a weapon. I sat there and I listened to her, and I defended you. And in her eyes, I saw that she wasn't just angry at you. She was angry at me for finally failing to be her perfect, obedient son." He shook his head, a look of deep self-loathing on his face. "All these years I thought I was keeping the peace. But I wasn't. I was just a coward, sacrificing your peace for my own comfort. And I am so sorry, Simone. I am sorry for every time I was silent, for every time I looked away, for every time I made you feel like you were the one who was wrong." His confession was not a plea for an easy forgiveness. It was a simple, brutal, and honest acknowledgement of the truth. It was the foundation upon which something new, if anything, could possibly be built. I looked at my husband, at this broken, humbled, and finally honest man, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of the love I had once had for him. But it was a different kind of love now, a love tempered by the hard, cold reality of his betrayal, a love that was now conditional on the man he would choose to be from this day forward. The final move, the one that would determine the shape of our future, came not from him but from his mother. A few days later, a formal, hand-delivered note arrived. It was on Vivian's thick, cream-colored, and impeccably embossed stationery. But the message inside was not one of her usual passive-aggressive commands. It was a simple, and for her, revolutionary request. "Simone," it read, "I believe it is time for us to discuss the future of this family. I have taken the liberty of reserving a private room at the Jefferson Hotel for lunch on Saturday. I hope you and Sterling will join me." The invitation was a peace treaty, a summons to a negotiation on neutral ground. I knew what it was. It was her surrender. The lunch at the Jefferson was a quiet, somber, and deeply civilized affair. We were not three family members having a meal. We were three diplomats, negotiating the terms of a new and fragile truce. Vivian was subdued, her usual formidable presence replaced by a quiet, watchful fragility. She had been defeated, and she knew it. But she was a woman of immense pride, and she would not be openly penitent. Her concession was in the meeting itself, in the fact that she had been the one to request it. We spoke of the future, and I, with Sterling now a silent, supportive presence by my side, laid out the new, non-negotiable terms of our engagement. The weekly Sunday brunches at her home, the obligatory performances of our family harmony were over. Visits in either direction would be by invitation only, with no expectation of acceptance. There would be no more unsolicited advice, no more backhanded compliments, no more critiques of my home, my clothes, my friends, or my character. My life and my house were my own sovereign territory, and she was welcome only as a respectful guest, not as a visiting monarch. I did not expect her to agree. I expected a final, prideful battle, but she simply listened, her gaze fixed on her water glass, the same kind of glass that had been the catalyst for this whole quiet war. When I was finished, she looked up at me, and her eyes held not anger, but a new, strange, and deeply weary respect. "You are a formidable woman, Simone," she said, her voice a quiet, simple statement of fact. "I underestimated you. That was my mistake. She then looked at Sterling, and for the first time I saw a flicker of a different kind of love for her son, a love that was not possessive, but one that was, perhaps finally beginning to let him go. She then raised her glass of water. "To new boundaries," she said. Sterling and I raised our own glasses. We drank. The peace treaty was signed. The war was finally, truly over.